Hey there, Tony DeWitt here. I'm a retired Missouri attorney now living my best life on a beach in Florida. I offer content and commentary on current events in the law as well as some general legal topics, but I do not dispense legal advice by video. With that understanding out of the way, here's what we're discussing today. Today, we're going to talk about the pardon power of the President of the United States. We're going to do that in the context of Joe Biden's last minute pardons, as well as his blanket pardons for his son and his family. And we'll talk about some of the commutations of the death penalty for several murderers. But we'll also discuss President Trump's recent pardons. Now, if you pay attention to the national media and also to the conservative media, you will hear a lot of things that are simply not true about the pardon power of the United States president. Many people believe that there is some way around those pardons. They believe that if you claim that President Biden was not in his right mind when he granted those pardons, that perhaps they could be undone. That's nonsense. Once those pardons are signed, they are absolutely good to go. In fact, if someone paid President Biden to do a pardon, you couldn't prosecute President Biden because it's a core presidential power. So the idea that any of these pardons, whether they were granted by President Trump or by President Biden, could be somehow undone is simply nonsense. Somebody is essentially engaging in micturition on your leg and telling you that it's raining. Pardons tend to be probably one of the most troubling powers for presidents. In decades past, the president waited until a few hours before he left office to issue most pardons, because people really like to see bad people get punished. And it also makes it easier to run for re-election to the presidency if you haven't opened the prison doors too far. One president who did not wait until the end of his term to pardon convicts was Abraham Lincoln, and he seems to have had a soft spot for African Americans. In October of 1863, a former Virginia slave owner came to him with a petition for a pardon and explained that it was a request for the pardon of a young black man who had been convicted of larceny in the District of Columbia. The petition stated the convict was a man of good character and had never been guilty of any offense before. So Lincoln asked what he had stolen. The guy told him it was $30 in silver. So Lincoln asked him, where did he find so much silver these days? Surely the temptation was great, and as you say, he is a good, kind fellow and not likely to be soon tempted in the same way again. I guess we'll have to let him out. Lincoln pardoned him on October 31st, 1863. It seems funny now that someone could simply walk into the White House and ask for a pardon for someone else, but that's what this gentleman did. Lincoln had a habit of taking the requests of wives and children to heart in pardoning soldiers, because in many respects he did not want to leave them destitute because their soldier, husband, or father had been killed for essentially violating military law. History is a good index of the power of the pardon. Many of the pardons granted throughout history have been for very good reasons, and many have been for very bad reasons. But you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and the pardon power is important because it has the capacity to undo injustice and effectively do justice. One of the benefits of having lived as long as I have is that I've seen a lot of things. I've actually experienced them in real time. Some of you who are much younger than me probably don't recall that in 1974, a young woman who was studying at Berkeley, Patricia Campbell Hearst, sometimes called Patty Hearst, the daughter of Randolph Hearst of the newspaper company and Hearst Castle, was kidnapped by a group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. It was a criminal terrorist organization in California. They were communists who wanted to effectively start an open revolt. But rather than act like a real military operation, they were more like, I don't know, rebels without a clue. One of their first actions was to shoot a black school board superintendent in Oakland. From there, they engaged in crimes like bank robbery and kidnapping, and along the way, various members of this supposed army were caught and convicted. So, being in jail, the remaining brain trust in the Symbionese Liberation Army decided that the way to get those people out of jail was to kidnap someone famous and use them as a hostage to get their buddies out of prison. So apparently, none of these people had ever watched a movie before, because if they had, they would know that the government doesn't negotiate to release prisoners. It just doesn't happen unless you're dealing with a prisoner swap for somebody like Russia. But for the most part, it never happens. So they thought, I know what, we'll grab old Patty Hearst and we'll use her to get our guys out of the jail. But Patty Hearst was special because she was a young woman. She was effectively brainwashed by the SLA during her captivity. She was held in a closet sized space where she couldn't even lie down, and she suffered from Stockholm Syndrome. Now, some of you may know what Stockholm Syndrome is, some of you may not. Several years before this event happened, there was a kidnapping or a train robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. And by the end of the hostage taking, when the prisoners were effectively released, they had bonded with their kidnappers and didn't want anything bad to happen to their kidnappers. So they called it the Stockholm Syndrome. Well, Patty Hearst was told after being held in captivity for many months that she could return to her normal life or join the group. And she felt like if she did not join the group, they would have killed her. So she joined and she participated in a bank robbery, and that got her 7 years in prison. I remember living through that period of time, and I followed that case in the newspaper pretty much every day. And it amazed me that they were even considering prosecuting Patty Hearst because she was so clearly a victim of basically of the mental torture that she underwent at the hands of the SLA. But they did prosecute her and they did convict her in spite of the best efforts of F. Lee Bailey, who was probably the best criminal defense lawyer that Randolph Hearst could hire. They sentenced her to 7 years in prison, which is actually a fairly light sentence for bank robbery, particularly in view of the fact that she was using uh, fully automatic firearms. But in spite of that, she only did 22 months in prison because Jimmy Carter commuted her prison sentence after that time. And then a few years later, Bill Clinton granted her a complete and full pardon. I remember thinking that the pardon was the right answer, given that she really had no choice but to join the group, and if you join the group, you have to join in the crimes that the group commits. So that's one way that pardons are traditionally used to overturn a miscarriage of justice. In 1795, President Washington made the difficult choice to forgive two Pennsylvania men sentenced to death for treason after they participated in protests known as the Whiskey Rebellion. The rebellion came after Washington proposed a tax on whiskey in order to shrink the national debt after the Revolutionary War. The Whiskey Rebellion broke out as a result. After the two Pennsylvania men were sentenced to death for treason, Washington pardoned them. It was a very controversial act at the time. Alexander Hamilton sought to pardon a man who had been convicted of robbing mail trains and who had been sentenced to death. Hamilton issued the pardon at his many friends' request, but the man refused the pardon. Instead, he got a suspended sentence at the end of a rope as a result. So you can do the stupid thing and hang from a rope if you, turn down your pardon. But you absolutely have a right to reject the pardon if you want to. Now, many people have criticized President Biden's pardon of over 1,500 people convicted of low-level drug offenses. This blanket pardon was asserted to be without precedent by some in the media, but there was ample precedent for it. In 1868, President Andrew Johnson issued a blanket pardon to all of the soldiers in the Confederacy who participated in the war against the Union. That was actually something that allowed Mr. Surratt to escape the hangman's noose. And this effort was part of Reconstruction, rebuilding the South after the Civil War. Later, all of those same soldiers were made veterans of the United States. That's what's called healing. Many of us remember that in 1974, President Ford pardoned President Nixon. Gerald Ford had been elevated to the status of vice president after the conviction of Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's first choice for vice president. Spiro got caught up in a corruption probe in Maryland, and he wound up pleading nolo contendere to the charges of corruption. He wound up doing actual prison time. So Nixon had to get himself a new VP, and he chose Gerald Ford. Well, when Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal, he was essentially forced to resign when the senators came to him and told him, look, if you go through with this, you're going to be removed. You're going to be the first president removed by impeachment. So he resigned. And then President Ford, who had ascended to the presidency after Nixon, pardoned him in order to speed the healing of the nation. It actually worked out pretty bad for President Ford because I think voters held that against him, and that's why Carter was elected and became the president after Ford. Now, plenty of people complained about President Biden pardoning his son and also his family members at the 11th hour. But that too has precedent. In 1984, on his last day in office, Bill Clinton pardoned his brother, Roger Clinton, who had served time in prison for cocaine distribution. The pardon solved one problem for Roger Clinton, but he quickly got into another scrape a few weeks later when he was convicted of drunk driving. Because, let's face it, some guys never learn. Nothing in the text of the Constitution prevents pardons for family or requires any particular process for granting pardons. Here are the actual words of the Constitution as it applies to the pardon power. Article 2, Section 2, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, and he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. The pardon is a core power of the President and is not limited in any way, nor can it be. Congress has no power over the pardon. Some people have alleged that Biden pardoned his family members because they were all involved in what they called the Biden crime family, and thus you had one co-conspirator paving the way for the others. Numerous people who apparently cannot read or don't understand precedent have suggested that these pardons are invalid. They are not invalid. Similarly, since they claim Biden didn't know what he was doing, doubtful, the pardons are void. Again, he knew who his family was. And again, the idea that they're void is incorrect. Even if Biden was a co-conspirator and his pardons were part of that conspiracy, because he was executing a core presidential power, Biden could never be prosecuted for that. But what Biden's pardons did do was make it possible for Trump to pardon all of the January 6 prisoners. It's pretty hard for the Democrats to claim the moral high ground when their president issued more pardons than any other president in history. Here's the bottom line on pardons. Biden had the power to do what he did. It is unreviewable by the courts or by Congress. Similarly, Trump had the power to do what he did. It is unreviewable by the courts or by Congress. That's the way the framers set it up. You don't have to like it, but it could only be changed if you amended the Constitution, and that's pretty unlikely. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks for watching my video. If you have a request for me to cover a topic, please send me an email to the address above, and in the subject line put video request. If you have comments, drop them in the comments down below. If you found the content worthy, please consider subscribing. Since I started doing this work, I have always asked listeners to consider doing just one kind thing every day to make somebody else smile or make their life better in some way. Please consider doing that. It makes the world a better place. Now, YouTube has some suggestions for other videos of mine you may find interesting.